In silence, millions live a life that is not theirs. They wear smiles they do not feel, say yes when they mean no, and build entire identities based on others' expectations. They are exemplary professionals, pleasant friends, obedient children. But somewhere deep inside they are exhausted. Exhausted not from doing too much but from never truly being seen. Exhausted from living out socially accepted versions of themselves while their very essence remains suffocated behind a mask. Carl Jung called this mask the persona, and he was emphatic. When someone completely identifies with it, they cease to exist as an authentic individual. In Jung's analytical psychology, the persona is a necessary adaptation mechanism. It is the social face we present to the world. However, when this persona becomes all that exists, when there is no longer a distinction between the mask and the face behind it, the human being enters a state of profound alienation. They live to be accepted. They act to be approved. And they feel that if they ever stop pleasing, they will disappear. Jung believed that this total identification with the persona is a form of neurosis, a failure in psychological development that prevents the individual from building what he called the self, the authentic and integrated center of the psyche. Such people are like actors who never leave the stage. They have a performance for every environment. The professional self, the social self, the family self. But if you ask who they really are, the answer comes with an uncomfortable silence, because in practice they do not know. This confusion between persona and real identity is what Jung saw as one of the great blockages to individuation. The process by which we become who we truly are. But why would someone live like this? Why would it be so difficult to simply be yourself? Jung pointed to childhood environments where love is conditional, where acceptance depends on behavior, where the child learns that they will only be loved if they meet others' expectations. Under these conditions, the individual never develops a solid internal core. They learn early on that surviving psychologically means pleasing. And in adulthood, this wounded child transforms into a human chameleon, compulsively adapting to avoid rejection, even if it costs their very soul. This is where the central concept of this video comes in. Jungian, not caring. But beware, this has nothing to do with emotional coldness, cynicism, or selfish indifference. For Jung, true not caring is a sign of psychological maturity. It is the ability to exist, to affirm one's values and authenticity, even in the face of disapproval. It is living from a validated internal center, no longer a hostage to external validation. Those who truly know themselves, who have integrated their shadows and broken free from masks, no longer need everyone's approval, because they have already approved of themselves. This video is about that, not how to become indifferent to the world, but how to finally stop living for it. We will explore in depth how identification with the persona traps, how childhood shapes this need for approval, and how the individuation process proposed by Jung offers an escape route not to isolation but to internal freedom. Because as long as you live to be accepted by everyone, you will never be accepted by yourself. And this may be the most devastating form of abandonment. On the surface, everything seems normal. The person fulfills their social roles with mastery. They are praised at work, considered reliable by friends, admired by family. But internally, there is an emptiness that no achievement can fill. This emptiness is a symptom of a deep rift between who one is and what one shows. Jung understood this dynamic as one of the main causes of modern psychic suffering. The identification with the persona. The persona is not a defect, it is necessary. We all wear social masks to function in groups. The problem arises when we forget that we are wearing a mask. Jung said that the persona is like a psychic uniform. It facilitates social interaction, defines roles, protects individuality. But when this mask becomes rigid, when the individual believes they are their persona, alienation is inevitable. They begin to live to sustain an image, no longer to express their truth. The self, which represents the psychic totality, the integration of conscious and unconscious light and shadow, is abandoned in the name of performance. Life turns into theater and the stage never closes. This dissociation between persona and self generates a series of symptoms. Constant anxiety, fear of judgment, difficulty making decisions without external approval, a sense of existential emptiness, and even depressive states. After all, how can one trust oneself if one was never allowed to exist without a mask? How can one have a sense of self-worth if their identity has always been constructed to please others? Jung saw this phenomenon as a pathology of modern civilization, the substitution of being for seeming. And the most serious part is that this substitution is not consciously perceived. Most people sincerely believe that their persona is who they are. The relentless executive believes they were born to lead. The always smiling woman believes that being pleasant is her true nature. The man who never sets boundaries thinks he is just generous, but behind these personas often lie repressed, exhausted, resentful individuals with a tremendous fear of facing who they really are, because that would mean disappointing those who expect them to be a certain way. This confusion does not happen by chance. It is reinforced by entire systems, schools that reward obedience, families that condition love to performance, religions that demonize natural desires, cultures that exalt image and reputation above authenticity. All of this shapes the persona and suffocates the self. It is no wonder that throughout life many people reach a point of internal collapse, not because they have failed, but because they have succeeded too much by being someone they have never been. The true challenge, according to Jung, is to reconnect with the self. But for that it is necessary to understand how this identification with the persona was formed, and for that we need to go back to the beginning, to childhood. It is there that the compulsive need to please originates, and that is what we will discuss next. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. No one is born needing the approval of everyone. The small child in its purest state is driven by impulse, authentic emotion, raw expression. It screams when it feels anger, cries when it is frustrated, lights up with enthusiasm when something fascinates it. It is simply what it is. But this state does not last long. At some point it begins to realize that certain expressions generate affection, others rejection. And so silently, without anyone needing to say it out loud, it learns love can be withdrawn. It can be conditioned, and therefore it must be earned. This is the breaking point. When a child realizes that it is only praised when it behaves in a certain way, that it is only hugged when it pleases, that it is only heard when it is calm, that it is only accepted when it hides its anger, it begins to shape its identity no longer based on its essence, but on its performance. It discovers that fully existing can be dangerous and then chooses to survive. To do this, it develops masks, acceptable versions of itself that ensure approval, protection, and love, and over time, it begins to forget who it was before all of this. This is where the psychological chameleon is born, the adult who decades later still lives by the same code. I will only be loved if I please, I will only be accepted if I adapt, I will only have value if I am useful, kind, polite, present, competent, even if inside I am imploding. This adaptation is not a rational choice. It is an emotional response to the primitive threat of abandonment. It is the child that still lives within the adult, desperately trying not to be rejected. Jung saw this distortion as a deep wound of the self. When a child grows up in an environment where love is conditional explicitly or implicitly, it does not develop an internal sense of worth. It develops a social radar. Instead of asking who am I, it learns to ask who do they expect me to be. Its compass stops pointing inward and starts spinning in circles around others' expectations. This failure in psychological development produces anxious adults disconnected from their true desires and chronically insecure. And the result is a cruel paradox. The more someone tries to please everyone, the less they are truly seen. The person dissolves into so many versions of themselves that in the end no one knows them, not even themselves. And this generates a loneliness that no amount of applause or recognition can fill. It is at this point that the urgency of not caring arises, not as an abandonment of relationships but as a rescue of identity. Jung believed that the cure for this compulsion for approval does not lie in pleasing better, but in consciously beginning to disappoint. And this is the next step in the process of individuation. In the next section, we will explore what Jung really meant by not caring, and why this ability may be the first sign of true psychological maturity. When Jung speaks about the ability to not care, he is not suggesting a cynical, nihilistic, or emotionally detached attitude. He is not celebrating the cold indifference of those who turn their backs on the world. On the contrary, Jungian not caring is a rare achievement attained only by those who have gone through the fire of self-discovery and emerged on the other side with a solid sense of inner center. It is essentially the ability to remain true to oneself even when that means disappointing others. For Jung, this kind of detachment is not selfishness, but maturity. It is the difference between acting based on internal convictions or based on the desperate need to please. It is the end of psychological slavery to external opinions. The individual who reaches this stage can indeed care about people deeply, even but in a selective and conscious way. They no longer need widespread approval to feel real. They exist even when they disappoint. They remain even when they are not validated. They live based on their own internal authority. This concept aligns with the process of individuation that Jung developed throughout his work. Individuation is fundamentally the birth of the self, the rescue of the true identity behind the masks, and one of the first signs that this self has begun to emerge is precisely the loss of the fear of rejection. The individual stops being driven by what will they think of me and begins to be guided by what is true for me. This does not mean becoming rebellious in opposition, but integral by conviction. It is important to note that this state does not arise suddenly. It is cultivated, it is trained, and Jung offers us concrete steps to develop this ability to not care in the right way. Not as denial but as differentiation. What follows is a true practical map of the individuation process. From recognizing the multiple personas you carry to confronting the shadow of selfishness that you have learned to demonize. This is where theory transforms into transformative practice. In the next segment we will dive into the 7 steps that Jung proposed to develop a real, authentic, and free self, and how each action, no matter how symbolic it may seem, represents a direct break from the prison of external validation. If up to this point we have discussed the problem, we will now begin to build the path to liberation. Jung did not believe in ready-made formulas. He knew that the human unconscious is vast, symbolic, and deeply individual. But he also knew that there are universal archetypes, recurring patterns on the path of those who decide to abandon their masks and find their true face. It was based on this that he outlined a practical process of individuation, a process that step by step trains the psyche to move away from dependence on persona and external approval, and to walk towards the authentic and autonomous self. The first step is brutally honest, identifying your multiple personas. Jung invites us to consciously map the masks we wear. Who do you pretend to be at work and with family? What do you exaggerate when you want to be admired? What do you hide to avoid rejection? When you write sentences like, "In this persona, I pretend," you begin to visualize the distance between your public image and your inner truth. It is the first cut, a separation between what is performance and what is essence. The second step is even more uncomfortable, tracking the motivation behind your actions. Jung challenges us to constantly ask, am I doing this because I want to or because I am afraid of disappointing? Most people live on autopilot, acting out of guilt, obligation, or fear. This exercise breaks that pattern and reveals that often even the most generous gestures are in fact desperate attempts to avoid rejection. It is a call to radical honesty with one's own motivation. The third step is a training of courage. The small betrayals of approval. Saying no when everyone expects yes. Canceling a commitment kept only out of obligation. Expressing an opinion you would normally hide. Each micro break is a psychological test, and the result is powerful. You discover that you survive, that the world does not collapse when you disappoint someone, and even more, you begin to feel the return of a vital energy that was being drained by constant submission. The fourth step is profound dialoguing with the inner critic. Jung proposes the use of active imagination to personify the internal voices that censor you. Who is this voice that calls you selfish? Where does it come from? From a strict parent? From a traumatic experience? From an internalized religious morality? This dialogue is not symbolic, it is transformative. Because when you recognize that the voice that limits you is not yours, you begin to regain control. The fifth step is a symbolic rite of death, killing a false identity. Perhaps you have always been the perfect child, the ever-available friend, the impeccable professional. But what if you simply let that persona die? What if for one day you acted in contradiction to that role? Jung taught that the birth of the self requires the death of the inflated ego, the identity built solely to be loved. This death is frightening, but on the other side of it, there is freedom. The sixth step is strategic, creating the ring of value. A visual exercise proposed by Jung in which you draw concentric circles to define the degree of importance that different people have in your life. In the center, you and your non-negotiable values. In the next circle, the few people whose opinions you truly value. In the outer circles, everyone else. This map serves as an antidote against the compulsion to please. It redefines who really matters. Finally, the seventh step is dark and necessary, integrating the shadow of selfishness. Jung asserted that people who live to please others often have a powerful shadow related to selfishness, a part of themselves that is repressed and judged. But there is a difference between healthy selfishness and pathological narcissism. Asking yourself without censorship, if I could be completely selfish, what would I do, is a way to uncover authentic desires that have been buried under the morality of performance. These 7 steps are not linear, they are living practices that should be revisited cyclically. Jung shows us that individuation is not a destination. It is a constant process of becoming real, and the further this process advances, the less need we have for external approval. Not because we become cold, but because we finally find something solid within ourselves. But what about those who still live like a leaf in the wind, shaped by every new expectation, exhausted from trying to be everything to everyone? In the next segment, we will explore the silent pain of living without a self and the transformative power that emerges when we finally have the courage to exist authentically, even if it means losing some masks along the way. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a type of suffering that does not show up in medical exams, that is not easily named in superficial conversations, but that slowly consumes the soul. It is the suffering of living without a true self, of spending days playing roles that seem right while inside accumulates a feeling of disconnection, of silent exhaustion. This is the suffering of the unlived self. Jung recognized this emptiness as one of the greatest tragedies of modern life. Individuals who achieve everything except themselves. People in this state often exhibit chronic restlessness. No matter how many compliments they receive, how many goals they achieve, how many relationships they maintain, there is always a sense of something is missing. That something is the self. They do not live from an inner center, but like leaves in the wind, reacting to external pressures, shaping themselves to what others expect, and believing that if they are good enough, pleasant enough, useful enough, one day they will feel complete. But that day never comes, and when the self finds no space to exist, it begins to manifest in symptoms: anxiety crisis with no apparent cause, a persistent sadness, a feeling of being fake all the time, an existential boredom that neither entertainment nor consumption nor achievements can numb. Jung saw this not as pathology in the clinical sense but as a symbolic cry from the unconscious, the soul asking to be lived. Living to please others is a form of betrayal, not against them but against oneself. It is to abdicate one's internal authority. It is to outsource one's existence to the desires of others, and the price of this is high. Superficial relationships, emotional burnout, a fragile sense of identity that crumbles at the slightest sign of disapproval. The truth is that the more you strive to be everything for everyone, the further you distance yourself from yourself, and paradoxically, the more alone you feel. But there is a way out. From the moment the individual decides to stop performing and starts to exist with all their contradictions, imperfections, and uncomfortable truths, something powerful happens. They begin to regain vital energy, no longer expending energy to maintain an image, but directing that energy to live with presence. Relationships change, priorities realign, and above all, a new capacity emerges to stand firm even when disappointing someone. The not caring arises naturally when the self begins to take root, not as coldness, but as clarity, not as isolation, but as integrity. The person does not become indifferent, but selective. They begin to choose where to invest their energy, with whom to be vulnerable, and which battles are truly worth fighting. They cease to be a leaf and become a tree, flexible when necessary, but deeply rooted in their own truth. And this transformation does not make them lonely. On the contrary, it finally makes them capable of truly connecting, because only when you stop performing can someone finally see who you really are, and only then do authentic relationships become possible. In the next and final part, we will conclude this journey by exploring how the process of individuation not only frees the individual from the neurosis of approval, but also empowers them to live with depth, presence, and authenticity. A new kind of life becomes possible, not centered on pleasing but on being. Becoming who you truly are comes at a cost, and it's not small. It requires disappointing people, breaking expectations, abandoning roles that once guaranteed applause and belonging. It demands crossing the visceral fear of being rejected and discovering that even so, you survive. It requires a symbolic death, leaving behind the persona you've spent your whole life building to be loved. But Jung was clear. Only when the inflated and conditioned ego dies can the self be born. The journey of individuation is neither comfortable nor linear. It is made up of internal ruptures facing the shadow and mainly of conscious choices. The choice to speak the truth even when it's uncomfortable. The choice to be integral even when it disappoints. The choice to live from an inner center, not from an external reflection. Each choice of this kind is a step toward psychic freedom. This freedom, however, is not the superficial freedom of doing what you want. It is something much deeper. It is the freedom of no longer needing the approval of others to feel that you have value. It is the freedom to bear your own weight in the world without needing to cling to others' acceptance. It is the freedom to love without losing yourself, to help without destroying yourself, to belong without getting lost. And most importantly, this freedom makes possible something that was previously impossible to truly relate. Because only when you have a real self to offer can you build authentic bonds. Only when you are grounded within can you give yourself fully. Jung never promised that this path would be easy. But he promised it is the only one worth taking. He said, "Those who look outside dream. Those who look inside awaken." The world is full of people dreaming of lives that are not theirs, trying to fill a void that no external validation will resolve. Awakening is becoming responsible for yourself. It is stopping being a leaf in the wind and becoming a tree. If this video touched something deep within you, it's because you might be ready to start letting the mask fall, ready to stop pleasing, ready to finally exist. Now I want to know from you, what mask do you feel you need to abandon? Comment below. Sharing your truth can be the first act of liberation. And if this video made you think, don't stop here. The next video continues this journey and is essential to deepen this process. Click now to watch, it's important. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming content. And above all, remember, you didn't come into this world to be loved by everyone. You came to become who you really are.